Well, hi there, Social Studies 30-1, taking a look at our third source of the week. We are examining illiberalism today. We have a photograph. We don't do a lot of photographs, although we should. I'll give you a few seconds to examine the photograph. Well, I don't know about you, but when I see a photograph in social studies, my first glance is always at the picture itself. And in this case, my eyes were drawn to the picket signs that they're holding. Ashcroft, go home, leave the Bill of Rights alone. Right away, I see a clue, and I think it's important. Uh, the Bill of Rights is where American citizens would find the entrenchment of their basic rights and freedoms. So the right to free speech, freedom of association, mobility, and so on. And in this case, it's saying leave the Bill of Rights alone, which means, the insinuation is they've lost some of those rights. We don't know anything specific yet, but right away I see trouble. I see people protesting the devolution of some of their rights and freedoms. And then the other sign I see says that dissent is patriotic. Dissent means you are protesting something, you're disagreeing with something. One of the basic premises of democracies is the freedom to disagree with your government. And in this case, the sign says dissent is patriotic. It makes me wonder why someone would even say that dissent is patriotic. So to me, that sign is a reaction to perhaps a policy, a proposed policy from the government, a comment from the government, saying that a true American citizen, a true patriot, does what their government tells them to do. Or at the very least, the person holding that sign thinks the government wants them to know that to be patriotic means to be quiet and do what your government says. Why else would someone say something like that? And in the foreground, I see just some regular citizens. They don't look overly happy. One thing that I just noticed, and I've looked at the source a few times now, is the guard in the background. There's a policeman holding a billy club, a nightstick. It makes me wonder, well, why is he there? So obviously something has happened uh, that maybe could make this protest turn violent, or maybe it has already been violent at some point, or they're thinking that maybe it could down the road. I don't know if it's a big important clue, but it's something that I noticed. And then my eyes shift to the excerpt at the bottom. New York, September 2003. Oh, I see a clue again. 2003. You need to use that date and think about what we've learned in chapter 11. 2003 would be in the aftermath of 9/11. And as soon as I think of 9/11, I think of the Patriot Act. Now some things are coming together. It looks like the protesters might be protesting the Patriot Act itself, in that maybe they think the Patriot Act went too far and took away, degraded some of their rights and freedoms as American citizens. Keep reading. It's a protest organized by the New York Civil Liberties Union. So a civil liberty is it's your rights and freedoms. So a civil liberties union would be a group of people that are advocating and protecting their rights and freedoms. Held while U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft uh, was promoting security legislation in a speech to law enforcement personnel. You do not need to know who John Ashcroft is. If you do, fine. um, I'm guessing no one does, and that's okay. But he's the U.S. Attorney General, which means that he he's in charge of lawmaking in the U.S. He's promoting security legislation. So what that would be legislation that makes American citizens more secure, probably at the cost of some of their, not all of their rights and freedoms, but some of their rights and freedoms, in a speech to law enforcement personnel. Now it's all coming together. So what's going on in the photograph is there's a speech being given by John Ashcroft, who he's likely trying to advocate for less rights and freedoms for Americans to protect them in the post 9/11 climate. So even though it's been 2 years since 9/11, during this whole time, America is still fighting the war on terror. They've invaded Afghanistan to protect American liberties. They are about to invade Iraq in the protection of American liberties. So now this is all coming together. Ashcroft wants to take away people's rights and freedoms, probably minimally. And you can speculate on what those be in light of the Patriot Act, probably freedom of association, probably mobility rights. And again, the Patriot Act was targeting, you know, weeding out terrorists in the US so there can't be a second 9/11. But a lot of people probably get lost in that shuffle and they lose their rights and freedoms too. The Patriot Act, after all, did say, the government was given broad, sweeping powers to see just who you are and what you're up to. So people would have their phone records searched, their emails records searched, their texts searched. So these citizens are probably protesting that and even further anti-terrorist legislation that would devolve their basic rights and freedoms, maybe even a bit more. At the very least, it would devolve their expectation to privacy. So I think that's probably as far as I would go in interpreting what we see in the photograph. In terms of your links, well, again, I see people in that photograph are protesting the government putting itself above the rule of law. I see people protesting the fact that they've lost some of their expected rights and freedoms um, because of the anti-terrorist legislation like the Patriot Act. I see people promoting their own self-interest rather than what is better for their country. And there's nothing wrong with that. We're not judging that. We're just saying that's likely what they're thinking. And so finally, when you examine a photograph and you establish perspective, you need to first of all think about what do the people in the photograph holding the signs think? What's going through their minds? Well, these are the people who would be most vehemently opposed to the government putting itself above the rule of law. They would rather have their rights and freedoms, perhaps, than security provided by the government. I mean, after all, that's what illiberalism is. It's striking a balance or promoting your security and freedom by taking away your rights and freedoms, which is kind of a contradiction in terms. So the people holding the signs would be against, they would be opposed to these government measures. The guard in the background, he might likely be in favor of these governmental measures. Maybe it makes his job easier. But the other point of view you need to establish would be the Attorney General or the government itself. They are the ones that are advocating these security measures. It's the government's belief that sometimes they need to go above the rule of law. They need to take away your rights and freedoms to make you secure, to protect your freedom down the road. And that would be the perspective provided by the government. Probably all I would do. So finally, the citizens holding the signs are challenging liberalism. They're critiquing liberalism, especially illiberalism. The government would be promoting illiberalism. And I think we're done that source. While we're at it, let's link them all together. So to review, here is the source from Tuesday's source one, talking about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it basically talked about how the freedom granted in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms gives people the freedom to maybe take away your freedoms. In other words, if you give people too much freedom, they can threaten the system that you're trying to protect in the first place. So think about perhaps a neo-Nazi or some kind of anarchist might use the freedom provided in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to threaten the system that guarantees your basic rights and freedoms. Something to ponder. Second source, of course, was the cartoon from yesterday. Again, post 9/11 climate, there now you're safe from terrorist attacks. We've taken away your right to privacy, your freedom of association, your freedom of mobility, but we've made you safe. And you're left thinking, is it really worth it? And then finally, there's today's source. So I think in terms of your connections, what you're looking at here, they're all connected to illiberalism. Source one is talking about how if you give people too much freedom, illiberal things can happen. And that maybe sometimes, it's justified that the government takes away your freedom, uses illiberalism to actually protect your freedom from internal and external threats. Source 2 is also connected through illiberalism in that this source is critiquing the government's use of illiberalism. It's saying it probably shouldn't happen. Um, and judging from the smiles on their faces, they didn't even know that it happened. So this one is highly critical of government illiberal measures. They would say that it's never worth it, never justified. And finally, in source 3, you're given the perspective of dissenters who also think that a government is never justified in going to illiberal measures. Government should never put itself above the rule of law if your freedoms are at risk. That's probably where I would go. I would link them through illiberalism because they are about illiberalism. You would need a third relationship, and that just might be perhaps sources 2 and 3 are clearly critical of illiberal measures, while source 1 is trying to logically explain why sometimes we need it, why sometimes there needs to be illiberalism to protect democracy. I'm sure there's more. I'm sure you can think of more relationships than that, but I think we pretty much covered it. We'll do another set of illiberalism actually next week as we continue that topic. Just so you know, if you had written the diploma exam this year, probably the sources were going to be about illiberalism. They have been for the last 3 years or so. I would think they would keep going down that road. Hope you got something out of that. I enjoyed interpreting those sources with you.